Good morning and welcome. I'm delegated to talk a bit about what subject matter we might comprehend in this project, and also perhaps a bit about the form the project will take. I have a certain amount of, I think, difference with what I've seen already in the documents that we have before us. That is conditioned in part by the fact that I was on the Smithsonian committee that was involved with the Enola Gay debacle. That was a bracing experience. World War II veterans felt so strongly that that exhibit should include no artifacts whatsoever from Hiroshima. Even that famous watch that stopped at 8:15, which was going to be one of the artifacts that the Peace Museum in Hiroshima was loaning to us, was simply anathema to these veterans of the war who felt that their comrades had fought and died, and that anything that even remotely indicated that the Japanese side would receive some kind of recognition was unacceptable. I don't mean that was frightening. I just mean that it was clarifying, if you will, about just how complex. I think all of us know that from the fact that we've been scholars and studied these issues, just how very complex this subject really is. Notice even already we've been laughing a little bit nervously about jokes about blowing things up. And that, I think, is the crux of the issue about how do you present a subject which on the one hand is a rich and deep vein of history of technology and of political and international issues, and on the other hand has a little bit of the stench of weapons of mass destruction around it. That, I think, is the heart of the problem. The official purpose of the workshop, let me just quote, to develop ideas for presenting the history of the Manhattan Project and its legacy to the public via a national traveling exhibition and other means. Such an exhibition would be the first to treat the Manhattan Project and its legacy comprehensively, which I think is interesting in itself. I've been researching a book on the Spanish Civil War and have been fascinated to find in Spain, all these years after Franco's death, that the war is still not something people can easily discuss, or that museums are yet prepared to present artifacts relating to. The Enola Gay experience, I think, was one extreme. Another was brought home to me when I was at a dinner party in Washington some years ago and was wearing one of those little badges that they had at Los Alamos to admit them into the explosive testing part of the laboratory complex. And the lady seated next to me at the dinner asked me what it was. It just had a number on it, and I told her, and she said, "My God, that's like wearing a badge from Auschwitz." And I was, needless to say, rather shocked at her response. But that, in a sense, is in the same range as the recent pronouncements by Representative Dennis Kucinich about this whole issue of having a national park, which, from his point of view, in a speech that I was struck with its ignorance of the facts, sadly, I'm sorry to say, didn't seem to him an appropriate subject for a national park or a series of national parks. These are the Scylla and Charybdis that we deal with, I think, when we're talking about these issues and thinking about how to present them. Whenever I'm baffled by these issues that surround the issue of the development of the energy of the nucleus and all of the huge transformations that it has brought to the world, I always go back to my touchstone, which is Niels Bohr. Bohr was the perhaps first really to think deeply and thoroughly about all of this and what it would mean in the long run for the world. he came here to Washington in the summer of 1944, back before air conditioning, when the Danish embassy got tropical hazardous duty pay for simply living in this city. Sitting in the embassy, darning his son's shirts, putting buttons on his son's shirts, Bohr thought through this whole deep question and went to Roosevelt and eventually went to Churchill. Churchill, of course, rebuffed him. Roosevelt was interested, but at that point not much happened. He was, of course, trying to convince the leaders that they needed to discuss all this with the Soviet Union before a bomb became a de facto announcement that we had a secret weapon that we hadn't shared with the Soviet Union. But in the course of writing the documents that he shared with Roosevelt and would have shared with Churchill, he talked about, and I'm quoting now, the whole enterprise constitutes a far deeper interference with the natural course of events than anything ever before attempted. And its impending accomplishment will bring about a whole new situation as regards human resources. Surely, he wrote, we are being presented with one of the greatest triumphs of science and engineering, destined deeply to influence the future of the world. He told of enormous energy sources which will be available that would, he said, revolutionize industry and transport, as of course they have. But of more importance, he felt immediately, was the fact that these new weapons would change, as he said, all future conditions of warfare. He said that better in 1957. He said, we are in a completely new situation that cannot be resolved by war. To me, that is the touchstone philosophic statement of what happened when we learned how to release nuclear energy. A completely new situation that cannot be resolved by war. Bohr, with his great sense of the complementarity of the philosophic world as well as the physical world, was looking at what good might come out of what, for many at Los Alamos, according to Victor Weisskopf, who remembered Bohr's coming there in the late December of 43, was a really dark and deep dilemma for physicists who had, as you know, really through the 30s, thought of their discipline as one rather spiritual and disconnected from the practical world of politics and so forth. He said Bohr came and he made some kind of clarity out of all of this. Well, I think Bohr can offer us some clarity too. These discoveries, this new insight into the natural world, required an adjustment that we're still going through. And if we can somehow embody that fact, that very deep fact, in the presentations that we're talking about organizing, we will get at not only a way, I think, to present this information to the general public while avoiding these outlying feelings of horror on the one hand and somewhat limited celebration on the other. We can also get at the real truth about what happened, which I think is not generally thought about, certainly not by the general public. It doesn't go much farther, as far as I can tell, than we've got all these bombs, and either that's great, we're safe, or what the hell are we going to do with them? There is that other part, and it's a more subtle part perhaps, but I think it's very much accessible to the kind of approaches that are available to museums and presentations of this sort. That's a general discussion of the question. The other part is, it seemed to me that many of the framed statements that we're working on at this during this program were framed in a way that speaks more to how historians think than perhaps to how the general public in coming into an exhibition might think. My personal list of subjects, trying to think in terms of someone walking into a presentation of this subject, would include these categories: science, bombs, biography, energy, and control. And by science, I mean the developments in nuclear physics from Röntgen forward, to the extent that it's possible to present those without overwhelming. I mean, I'm going to make a list that's much longer than I think any single exhibit could offer. But it's out of this body of material, fundamentally historical, that I think we need to draw for the exhibitions that we're thinking about. And of course, science is particularly suitable for exhibitions in the sense that it's involved with real and physical objects, whether instruments in a laboratory or natural materials or presentations of machinery of various kinds. These things are all there to be more or less interactive to the extent that that can be made possible. I live near San Francisco, where the Exploratorium, Frank Oppenheimer's wonderful museum, gives one a real sense of, I mean, when the kids are running around that museum, it's total cacophony for everyone there. And the things are whirring and lights are flashing and all sorts of interesting things are happening at once. Leading up, I presume, to the discovery of nuclear fission, with the fundamental understanding built into the exhibition, and this I think is why I put 200 pages of the history of the development of nuclear physics in my book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, ahead of the wartime story. The idea that somehow the scientists, in a Faustian bargain sort of way, could have gotten together and said, oh, let's not talk about this discovery, is totally refuted by the history of the science that preceded it. You know, if the discovery hadn't been made in Nazi Germany in December 1938, it would have been made at Berkeley a few days later, or in Paris a few days later. Everyone was ready. It was, as someone said, overripe. And I mean, if those of you who've had a chance to talk to some of the people who were around at the time, I remember talking with Clint Seaborg. He was in a blue funk for 2 days afterwards. He just wandered around Berkeley because he was a very ambitious scientist and he'd missed the most important discovery of the century from his point of view. So I think it's important to do something to represent the preceding science, to show that, as is always the case with science, there's an inevitability about a discovery when it finally comes, because of all the work that has preceded it. And therefore the bombs, as they ultimately came to be, the reaction as it was in 1938 and 1939, followed logically from all the other things that had preceded, and wasn't something that a group of scientists could just simply lock up in a cave somewhere. The development during the Second World War of the science behind nuclear weapons. I mean, the creation of plutonium, the invention of the nuclear reactor, the physics of the bomb itself. That's another aspect of science that could well be part of the story. And I think, again, would give it connection to the larger world of science that it properly connects to. And then the post-war world of nuclear science, particularly, I think, as applied to medicine, but also medical diagnostics, food preservation, which is something we don't see much of in the United States, but is a major factor elsewhere in the world, and other useful applications. That's the science part, as I just roughly sketch it. By bombs, I mean not only the development of the atomic bomb itself, and of the later development of, presumably, of the hydrogen bomb and the proliferation of those weapons, of that weapons technology around the world, but also the previous history of strategic bombing. I'm looking particularly in this book on the Spanish Civil War about the bombing of Guernica, which is a direct precedent to the bombing of Hiroshima. People who labor over the moral issue of the dropping of the atomic bombs, I think, have always been a little misplaced. The issue was decided when the United States Air Force went to area bombing and firebombing in 1943 and 44. The atomic bombs, from the Air Force's point of view, were not any larger in scale, as indeed they were not, except to the extent that you didn't need 1,000 planes to carry them, than what had been going on all over Japan before. So the development of strategic bombing, which I've always thought was a logical outcome of the horror of the trenches and the stalemated lines during the First World War, here was what looked like a magic technological solution. You could jump over those stalemated lines and go straight to the enemy's heart of its homeland. And as you know, the strategic bombing theory could so terrorize the populace that it would rise up in wrath and overthrow its leaders and sue for peace, which, needless to say, never happened. But most of the issues that we've come to think of as the deterrence debate had already been worked through before nuclear fission was even discovered. So there's a prehistory. Indeed, to all of these subjects, I think there's a prehistory that it would be interesting to get at, to the extent that that can be done. Again, to give depth and power to this more isolated range of things that we're specifically centering our work on. And of course, the Manhattan Project story itself, and the story of the use of the weapons in Japan, nuclear proliferation, which of course began before the first bomb, in the form of Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall and presumably some other people we've never identified. That surely was the first category of proliferation, but it followed from there in an interesting way, from country to country, always, it seems to me, matched until quite recently by another country that the country that was going nuclear felt threatened by, so that you get this kind of pairing as you go through. And again, how you would talk about in a museum exhibition these rather complicated political issues, I truly don't know. But of course there are all the resources that those of you here who are experts will, I hope, tell us about. I mean, I think of the obvious, which is interviewing people and having their testimony there on tape. But the documentation is deep and rich, and the question will be how to make it come alive. The invention of the hydrogen bomb, Cuban Missile Crisis, deterrence, these are all things that I think would center around the whole business of starting from one locus, how this viral development spread around the world and still spreading. Biography is sort of obvious, the biographies of the principal scientists and the military and political leaders who were involved all the way through. By energy, I mean the parallel and complementary development of nuclear energy as a source of power, beginning with Szilard and Fermi's invention of the nuclear reactor, and moving forward through Atoms for Peace, which is a really interesting package. We're still trying to retrieve all of the highly enriched uranium that we dispersed around the world during Atoms for Peace. I talked to a couple of guys a few years ago who had been given the assignment of pulling the fuel out of a research reactor at the University of Hue in Vietnam just before the North Vietnamese invaded the city. They didn't want to leave that HEU in North Vietnamese hands. They drove in a truck and discovered that they had to figure out how to pull the fuel, and they didn't have any tools. So they calculated how much radiation dosage they'd get and put their gloves on and pulled the fuel by hand, threw it in the back of the truck, and got the hell out. Those are wonderful stories if we can find them. And then the expansion of nuclear technology to today, to its present increasing situation as a source of world energy. I was just at the Sundance Film Festival. There's a new documentary called Pandora's Promise, which received great response at Sundance, a little bit to my surprise, because it's based on the fact that many environmentalists are changing their minds about nuclear power, realizing that if global warming, which is obviously here and now and real, that nuclear power is going to be one of the few sources of energy that can perhaps help deal with that immense problem. The director told me that he usually gets about a 60% conversion rate when he shows this remarkable documentary. But it in itself was really quite educational. There's one detail that throughout this documentary where a hand, I presume it's the director's or one of his associates, holding a dosimeter with a rather large number on the front, simply stands at various places around the world, from Fukushima to the black sands of the Brazilian beaches, and shows the level of radioactivity. And of course, the black sand beaches down in Brazil are like 119, and Fukushima is 19, except for a few hot spots. It's really compelling to just see the facts for a change, instead of hearing the endless debate about the virtues and vices of nuclear power. That's the kind of documentary, and there are, of course, many others that might well be built into an exhibition, so that people could get a taste over the years of how these subjects have been dealt with, but also learn from each of the documentaries. There are a lot of resources like that out there, of course, including the museums that some of you direct, where materials could be pulled in for the traveling exhibition. And by control, of course, I mean the efforts beginning perhaps with Bohr's approach to Roosevelt and Churchill in 1944 to control and limit these developments and to prevent nuclear catastrophe. How these categories might be organized, I don't know. They could be, of course, chronologically. I inevitably, when I'm writing history, end up going back to chronology because it's such an obvious and straightforward way to organize history, which is chronological, more or less. But it's not the only possible way. It certainly could be organized around subjects of various kinds, with some historical timeline within each subject area. It seems to me that this kind of structure could include the questions that were on the documents that we came to this meeting with in hand. Of course, the question of whether we should have dropped the bomb, what the circumstances were that led us to decide to do so. Those are eternal and interesting questions. I'm just thinking that if they're presented in the larger context of the scientific and military and political reality historically, it might detoxify them a bit and make them less susceptible to people breaking down the museum doors because they don't agree with what's on the wall. In a sense, I think that those questions are a second level of discourse, and the primary level might well be the classic questions: who, what, where, when, and then why. Why is the second level. Thank you.
Very good.